Hello everyone, I'm Miss Shrek, and today we are going to be looking at the civil rights movement and specifically the master narrative and how it really comes into effect during this time and how that plays out. So if everyone can go right ahead and open up the PowerPoint, it is going to look like this. It's the Civil Rights and Master Narrative PowerPoint. And then we are going to work on the first part of the choice board, which is number 1, which is what is the master narrative and how does it manifest? And if you want to go right down to slide number 4, that is where we are going to start. So we are going to start looking at this master narrative. So the really important question here is, what is a master narrative? The master narrative, we can look at it as a top-down rhetoric to describe what happened during the civil rights movement, and it's specifically focused on describing discrimination as a moral issue rather than focusing on its other facets such as economic or political. And it also focused mainly on national leaders and national institutions, institutions such as the Supreme Court and those large-scale decisions. At the same time, it also downplayed a lot of events that made the government look unfavorable, as well as grassroots movements and leaders who really did not fit the normative story. So this master narrative is not something that you are going to look at as you are looking at it on the screen right now and think that you've never heard this before. It's the same story that is in your textbooks, the same story that's been there probably since you started in elementary school. So I'm going to look us right over at this master narrative, and I'm not going to read it out for you. I'm sure you can read it yourselves. But as we're looking at this, let's start to think about what parts in this are warped or are not correct, and then we know that are not correct or have been differently interpreted. So some things that we can look at about this are the way that this narrative frames the federal government as agreeable and amenable to change. It says right in the first part that the Americans were inspired by the court, and the Supreme Court took this action in Brown versus Board of Ed all by itself to integrate the school systems, that it was so progressive, which we obviously know is not true. There was many events that led up to this, starting as far back as the 1920s and the 1930s. And it made our leaders seem more progressive and anti-racist than they really were. As we will see in some later parts of this lesson, even the presidents, which at that time were JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson, did not always come across in a favorable light if we really research them. We can see that Lyndon B. Johnson ordered Martin Luther King to be looked at by the FBI, as did JFK. And we can also find that the FBI was using unfavorable practices to do those investigations. And of course, we know that the federal government did not just decide that they were going to integrate the school system. This was something that occurred after decades of civil rights movements already occurring by the African American community. So something else we can look at while we're looking at this is that the leaders that are mentioned in this little excerpt are all powerful men. Normally they are white men. They also do mention Martin Luther King, but they are also usually white men, and they're usually well educated. So this excludes women and individuals who might not have had those opportunities to become educated. So usually those that are from impoverished communities, which at this time a lot of Black citizens were part of those impoverished communities. It also emphasizes the role of national figures while minimizing the effect of ordinary people. So these ordinary people, people like you and me, are not really even talked about in this section. But something that we'll see in one of our later readings for today is that a lot of the times these were movements started by students or youth or a mother, and it was just people getting together and in mass, and that's how those changes really started to take place. It didn't always have to be Martin Luther King, it didn't always have to be Malcolm X. It was just the small changes and not always a giant event, not always a very large scale law that was passed by the government. Change can occur in graduated increments and not just all at once. So it also, if we're looking at this paragraph again, it erased much of the violence that occurred. It doesn't talk about a lot of the riots that occurred both before, during, and after the civil rights period that we have come to understand between 1964 and 1965. I meant 1954 and 1965. And it also, we lose a lot of the complexity of the African American community. We're assuming that everyone that followed these great leaders, the Malcolm X's and the Martin Luther Kings, were all believed the same things that they did. And of course, that wasn't true. There are many different facets and belief systems that were going on. Those were just some of the people that were leading these groups, but they didn't speak for every single person in that group. Also, there is a concentration on the mid-50s to the mid-60s that downplays the importance of events that occurred both before and after this time period. So when we talk about the civil rights period or the civil rights movement, that's usually the time period we're talking about, but some of these events started happening much before that. We had the Tulsa Black Wall Street was burned in 1921. So even as far back as that, we were starting to see this movement occur. And then after this movement, or after the end of the movement in 1965, it didn't just automatically end. There wasn't some giant stalemate of these marches. The people continued to move forward and still try and make progress. There were still riots, there were still freedom marches, but it wasn't the end, and we can't forget those struggles that came afterwards. And another thing that this paragraph seems to miss is that it decides that discrimination is only a moral issue, and it ignored the economic and political concerns as well as the violence that was occurring against African Americans at this time. And those are two very important things to take into account. So the master narrative succinctly is just this kind of a rhetoric that downplays the less normative version of history, the version we don't see in our textbooks. And this is supported by racism because it upholds systemic racism that a lot of people in the upper echelon of our society still currently benefit from. It upholds ideas such as the mass incarceration of African Americans, poverty, redlining, and also I think this idea is also upheld by nationalism, the idea that we just want one cohesive story that puts our nation in a favorable view, and we don't want to keep rehashing the past because it's too painful to look at. So we just want to have a happier version of the story, and we don't want people to question that. So because of these things, we are still seeing this master narrative becoming incredibly pervasive even to this day. So as we go along in this lesson, you'll see some more applications of the master narrative at both the time in the civil rights movement, both before and after the official civil rights period. And we will also look at some of the effects of the master narrative today. So have a good day. Bye, guys.